These are the tools you'll be using to disassemble the POC. You'll need a Phillips head screwdriver, straight blade screwdriver, small pair of wire cutters, small pair of needle nose pliers. When we get to the sieve bed, you'll have to use a piece of tubing to protect the sieve and a plug. Also required will be small wire ties, approximately 3 inches in length, and you'll also need 2 wire ties when we replace the battery. Okay. All right, the first step you need to do for taking apart the POC is to remove the 4 screws from the back of the device. You also will have to remove the security label, which will not be replaced when we reassemble this device. Okay. With the screws removed from the back cover and the label taken off, the next step is to remove the sieve beds, which are contained in the back cover, so that you have access to the sieve beds. You take a screwdriver, a flat blade screwdriver, and hold the sieve beds and pull the cover away from the sieve bed assembly. Okay, with the sieve bed assembly exposed, our next steps are to remove the Tygon tubing from the sieve bed assembly, and there's 3 tubes that have to be disconnected. This small tubing on top, there's a wire tie that has to be cut, and then there's 2 Tygon tubes that come from the compressor, and the wire ties that hold it to the sieve bed have to be cut, 1 and 2 here. And the last thing that has to be disconnected is the plug from the circuit board. This is the plug that needs to be disconnected from the circuit board. I have now cut the wire ties to the 3 Tygon tubes, 1, 2, and 3, and I have pulled the plug off the circuit board. The last part of this step is to take the clip that holds the Tygon tubing in the shape and remove that. This is the sieve bed assembly removed, right? And this is the clip that I took off the Tygon tubing that holds the Tygon in place when it's reassembled. When the sieve beds are removed, it is a good practice to put tubing on the 2 ports, right, and a plug, a rubber plug, in the outlet for the oxygen. And what this does is stop any moisture from being drawn into the sieve beds when they're being held and waiting to be reassembled. Alright, the next step is to remove the circuit board from the POC. When replacing it, the first thing you have to do is there is 5 plugs that have to be removed from the circuit board. The first one that I'm pointing at is for the battery. Then there's 2 plugs down here, 1 for each fan. Then there's an alarm plug that comes from the compressor, and the last plug is the plug for the compressor itself, the power supply for the compressor. Also, there are 2 tubes, Tygon tubes, that have to be removed from the circuit board. One I'm pointing at here is the pressure sensor, and that wire tie will have to be cut. And the other one is on the sensor for the POC, and this also has to be cut, and both of those Tygon tubes have to be removed. Alright, I have removed the 5 plugs from the circuit board, and I have cut the 2 wire ties on the Tygon from the sensor and the pressure sensor. The next step to remove the circuit board is you have to remove the 4 Phillips head screws, and also this plug for the valve has to be removed from the device. It's a good time to mention that when you are removing a circuit board from the POC, you should be grounded, meaning ESD protection, and so that you do not apply any static to the circuit board. This shows that I have removed the plug from the circuit board from the valve, and I also have removed the 4 screws that hold the circuit board in place. The next step is to pull the circuit board away from the POC. The last step to remove the circuit board from the POC is to disconnect the 2 ribbon cables that come from the control knob. This is done by pushing on the tabs on either side of the clips that hold the ribbon cable. When these tabs are depressed, the clips will swing open and the ribbon cables can be pulled away. Right. Now the ribbon cables are ready to be pulled from the clips. This shows that the circuit board has been removed, and it also shows that the ribbon cables that come from the control knob are sitting against the battery, ready to be reassembled in the future. Okay, the next step for disassembling the POC is to remove the plastic plate that covers the compressor housing. There are 4 Phillips head screws that have to be removed before this can be done. I have removed the plastic plate by taking out the 4 Phillips head screws. This now exposes the compressor assembly and the fan assembly. Okay, to remove the compressor assembly, the first step is to cut the wire tie that is on the Tygon tubing, the lower Tygon tubing, where the screwdriver is pointed at. Once this is cut, then the compressor assembly can be pulled out of the POC. When you're removing the compressor from the POC, you have to pull the Tygon out of the slots, right? And you also will have to pry the lower Tygon tubing off of the nipple that goes into the reservoir. So the best thing to do is use a flat blade screwdriver like I have in my hand to gently move the Tygon away from the nipple, and then you're ready to pull the compressor assembly upward, and it will come out of the unit as a complete assembly with the fans attached on the bottom. Okay, the next step in disassembling the POC is to remove the reservoir assembly that also contains the battery. To do this, you have to disconnect 2 pieces of Tygon. This is the inlet for the air that's pulled into the POC, and this is the sensor tubing, the Tygon tubing that goes into the reservoir. So you have to pull the Tygon off of this valve, and you have to pull this Tygon out of the slots that hold it in place on the POC. Okay, this shows that I have disconnected the Tygon from the valve, and have also moved the Tygon out of the slots on the POC. Now we're ready to move the reservoir assembly, remove the reservoir assembly from the POC. And all you have to do is pull gently upward, and the whole reservoir assembly with the battery will be out. With the reservoir removed, if your goal is to replace the battery, the next step would be to cut the wire ties that hold the battery in place, and then you're ready to remove the battery from the reservoir. Okay, I have now cut the wire ties that hold the battery, and the battery is now easily removed from the device. Okay, this step is if we need to replace the control assembly for the POC, the first step would be to remove the knob and set that aside, right? And then the whole assembly here would have to be pried away with a flat blade screwdriver to replace it with a new one. The last step in disassembling the POC is to remove the valve, right? This is done by using a 3 32nd Allen wrench and a 1/4 open end wrench. Okay, to remove the valve, the first thing you want to do is get the handle out of the way for the POC. So we'll just take the handle and set it aside. Then the 3 32nd wrench goes into the hose barb, right, for the cannula. So you insert that in there, and then the 1/4 open end wrench goes on the other end. You hold the 1/4 end wrench and turn the Allen wrench, and you'll hear it break free. Okay, the next step is to reassemble the POC, and the first thing we'll do is to add the new 3-way valve, right, and the reinstall the hose barb into the fitting and the Tygon tubing. What I point out here is that when you attach the hose barb to the fitting, you need to use 1 drop of 380 Loctite. Okay, this shows that I have now reinstalled the hose barb into the mating fitting and the Tygon is in place. Stop. Okay, the next step is to reinstall the reservoir, and when you do this, you'll have to reattach the battery to the reservoir using these large wire ties. This shows the battery reinstalled into the reservoir. You can see from the label, the label is the date that the battery was installed, and also you can see that the wire ties are in place now. I've trimmed one and I'm going to trim the second so that the ends are not in the way. Alright, the next step is to put the reservoir back into the POC, into the retaining slot in the case. This is done by taking the reservoir and sliding it in place. And then the intake tubing should be placed back in the tabs on the case. The next step is to reapply the control knob onto the case of the device. By doing this, what you want to do is take the ribbon cables and push those through the slot on the case and then align the label onto the front of the case. This shows that the control knob is back in place and the ribbon cables are now against the battery, ready to be installed back onto the circuit board. Okay, the next step is to reinsert the ribbon cables into the corresponding clips, and you can tell that these clips are now free and they're ready for the ribbon cable to be reinstalled. So what you have to do is push the ribbon cable into the clip and then push against the clip onto the board so that the clip retains the ribbon cable. This shows that the ribbon cables are back in place into their corresponding clips, and now you're ready to lay the board flat into the POC case. Once this is done, then you can reinstall the 4 screws that hold the board in place. Okay, our next step is to reinstall the 3-way valve back into the POC. And first step you have to do that is to cut the Tygon tubing that is supplied to you off the fitting. So it shows the black mark here. You want to cut the Tygon tube approximately where that black mark is. Okay, now we're going to reinstall the Tygon back onto the valve. There's 3 pieces of Tygon that have to be reinstalled onto the valve. The first one comes off of the reservoir and is laying here. That goes onto the first barb. The Tygon that goes from the cannula goes onto the center barb, and the piece of Tygon that you cut off of this fitting goes onto the third barb. The piece of Tygon that I have in my hand that comes off of the third barb off of the valve now gets plugged into the sensor on the circuit board. It goes onto the top port of the sensor, and please use caution when doing this. You want to hold the sensor when you push the Tygon onto that top barb. Also note that you will need to put a wire tie onto the Tygon before it's pressed onto the barb to hold it in place. What I'm going to do is show you how to install an isolation valve into a Precision Medical POC. Precision Medical has 2 different models of POCs out in the field right now. The first models that came out had a valve in the device that was a 2-way valve. The newer models have what they call a three-way valve. In this demonstration, I'm going to show you how to put the isolation valve in the model with the three-way valve. To install the isolation valve into the POC, there is two pieces of tubing that have to be cut and removed from the device. The first is the tubing that is connected to the sensor that I'm pointing to. That will have to be removed from the pressure sensor. The other piece of tubing is on the third port on the valve, right, that I'm pointing at. That tubing also will have to be altered to install the isolation valve. This shows that I have removed the valve, right, and disconnected it from the stainless steel barb that holds the cannula, and I've also disconnected the tubing from the pressure sensor. What you want to do now is take this tubing and cut it off at approximately 2.5 inches. So from the valve, that third port, right, that tubing should be cut at 2.5 inches. Okay, this shows that I've installed the isolation valve onto the tubing from the three-way valve, and then this piece of tubing is going to connect with the pressure sensor on the board. This is a critical step, and something you have to pay attention to is that the cone shape of the isolation valve goes towards the pressure sensor on the board. It's critical that they go in this direction. Okay, this shows that I have now installed the isolation valve into connecting it to the three-way valve and onto the pressure sensor, and the tubing is in place. Please note that the isolation valve is laying on top of the reservoir and the way it is located. This shows that I've reconnected the three-way valve onto the PC board, and the tubing has now been routed from the valve into the pressure sensor. Please note that it's very, very critical that when you're installing this tubing that you make sure that it is not pinched from either end of the isolation valve or from the three-way valve into the isolation valve. This is the POC that only has the two-way valve in place. And you could tell this in that on the bottom of the valve only 2 ports have tubing connected. What you have to do to put the isolation valve in place is you have to disconnect the Tygon tubing from the pressure sensor, and you also have to take off the tubing that is attached and take out the cannula barb. Okay, what this shows now is that I have disconnected the valve, and again notice that this is a two-way valve. Only 2 of the Tygon tubes are connected to the valve. And note that the tubing that I have taken off the sensor I have now marked right at 2.5 inches. So what we're going to do is cut this tubing off at 2.5 and then attach it to the isolation valve. Okay, this now shows that I have attached the isolation valve to the Tygon tubing off of the port on the cannula, and now I have put Tygon tubing going from the cone. And again, this is important to see that the isolation valve with the cone shape on the end is the part that attaches to the pressure sensor. Okay, this now shows that the isolation valve is completely installed. Again, note that the cone and the tubing going to the pressure sensor on the board, the cone is pointing at the pressure sensor. Also note the way the isolation valve is laying there. Be careful not to crimp the tubing when you put it in place. And then you'll notice that the two-way valve that I pulled aside, when you're done, it will swing back in this direction. And also notice that I have reconnected the valve onto the board. Okay, the next step is to attach the Tygon tubing that I'm pointing at here back onto the pressure sensor on the circuit board. When you do this, it's best to put the wire tie onto the tie gun first, then push the tie gun onto the pressure sensor, and then pull the wire tie snug. All right, we're at the step where we're going to replace the compressor back into the case, but at this point I wanted to mention that Precision Medical is replacing the compressors in the devices, and so you'll see a different design of the compressors. I'm going to point out that this is the old style compressor and this is the new style compressor, and you can notice that the new style is a little bit shorter than the old style compressor, and there is no gold on the top. This is important to mention in that the old style uses software P008. So when you turn on your POC and you look at the software on the board, the old style compressor uses P008. To run the new compressor, the new style, the board has to have software in it A001. Again, this is critical that when you have a new compressor, you use A001 software for the board. Okay, this step shows the compressor and the fan assembly, and this is a good place to show you that if you had to replace the fans on the POC, if you had damaged fans and you had to replace it, this is what you would have to have removed to do this. The fans just pull off the bottom of the compressor, so they're free, right? And then you would have to cut the two wire ties on this wire bundle to remove the fan power lines. To put the new fans in place, all we would do is get the fan assembly, right? You would, and I'm not showing this, but you would put the cables back onto the bundle, wire tie them in place, and then you would push the fan assembly back onto the bottom of the compressor like that. Now we're getting ready to reinstall the motor. The first thing you want to do is put a wire tie onto the bottom tie gun, right, so it's in place ready to be tightened, right? The other thing you have to look at is that the fan assembly goes into the slot on the case, right? And that bottom tie gun tube goes onto the nipple inside the case. Okay, this shows that the compressor is back installed in the case. You can see that the fan assembly is back in the grooves on the case. You also can see that the tie gun is inserted on the nipple. I have not pulled the wire tied shut or tight yet, but it's ready to be tightened. And also it shows that the tie gun from the compressors are in their proper slots on both sides. And the last thing you want to do is push this wire bundle back in place. Okay, the next step would be to plug all the components back into the circuit board. You have the power for the compressor that has to be plugged into the first jack, then the alarm compressor, and then the two power leads for the fans. And this is important to note that it doesn't matter which power socket these go for the fan, that they can go into either or, right? And the last thing, which we cannot forget, is the valve has to be plugged back into the circuit board. This shows that all the plugs are back in place for the circuit board. And please note also that we have now plugged the valve back into the top corner of the circuit board. Stop. All right, the next step is to place the cover for the compressor back in place and reinstall the 4 screws. Okay, the next step is to reinstall the sieve bed assembly, and the first thing you have to do is remove the Tygon tubing and the plug that you put in place to keep the sieves from getting wet. To reinstall the sieve bed assembly, what you've got to do is put the Tygon tubing back onto the ports on the sieve bed. It's important to note that you watch these, the nipples that are sticking out, and the one that is closest to the wire where the plug goes into the circuit board, that should be the high one when you're looking at it, and the other side or the left side should be the low one. Now what you want to do is install these back onto the Tygon, and then the small Tygon tubing goes back onto the filter assembly. Okay, the next step will be to put the clip for the Tygon tubing back in place, and then to plug in the circuit board, the plug from the sieve beds onto the circuit board. Okay, this step shows that we have now put the handle back in place, right, and we are ready now to put the cover back onto the sieve bed assembly. This shows that I've now put the back cover back onto the sieve bed assembly, and I'm ready to put the 4 screws in place. The last step is to reinstall the knob assembly.